Ad hoc solidarity is not enough. That's the message coming out of Brussels today on asylum seekers. EU commissioners are sketching out a new migration pact which seeks to share responsibility more fairly between member states. The idea is to speed up asylum requests, more quickly define who's eligible for the status, and support all of the EU 27 when it comes to welcoming new arrivals. Well, this comes after a devastating fire earlier this month at a camp in Lesbos, which left thousands of vulnerable people homeless and put migration back in the spotlight. Well, for more on that story, correspondent Dave Keating joins us now from Brussels. Dave, hi. What can we expect from the EU commissioners today when it comes to the details on this new migration pact?
Well, this is essentially a second try by the European Union. If at first you don't succeed, try again. There was a previous EU agreement on migration, which was supposed to see refugees and asylum seekers spread across EU member states so that the burden didn't fall entirely on those southern European states, most notably Greece and Italy. But that fell apart. That agreement was approved by a majority vote because it's not one of the areas in which you need unanimous approval by all 27 EU countries. And basically, the countries that voted against it just refused to do it. These are mostly Eastern European countries, notably Hungary and Poland. They said, we don't care what we signed up to or what was agreed to in EU law, we're just not going to do it. This is the Commission kind of acknowledging that they can't force Hungary and Poland to take in refugees. So the key difference with this new proposal is that instead of making the countries take in the refugees, they're going to make the countries pay to return refugees who have had their asylum request denied back to their country of origin. So essentially, a country like Hungary would be given responsibility for specific refugees. It would be in charge of the funding and logistics for returning them to their home countries. And it's hoped that if they can get approval by this from Hungary, that this would change the mind of Hungary and Poland and some other countries. These countries, particularly Hungary and Poland, are notoriously not welcoming places for immigrants. Their biggest concern was not having the refugees come into their territory. And so if they can just spend some money to help with this EU solidarity, it's hoped that this new agreement can actually work.
Well, indeed, as you mentioned there, they don't necessarily need the signature of every member state, all of the 27 nations, but presumably the EU needs majority support to implement this plan. What sort of resistance do you think they're going to come up against? Do you see some complications arising?
Yeah, they do only need a majority vote, but I think this time they're really going to be trying to get a unanimous vote because of what happened with the previous agreement. So we're going to have a test of that in early October when Home Affairs ministers meet. We may actually have this discussed by EU presidents and prime ministers at their summit next week. That's been postponed from this week because the council president was in close contact with somebody with COVID. So we'll see. Of course, as you mentioned at the top, that the big impetus here is to avoid another situation like we saw with that devastating fire in Lesbos. The situation there, of course, where the refugees were building up there, so many refugees, because EU countries were not taking them in. They weren't adhering to this previous policy of taking the refugees and spreading them around Europe. So the Commission is going to be accused. I'm sure they're going to announce this in about an hour with a virtual press conference. We're still not allowed to have live press conferences here. And I'm sure they're going to be asked about the inhumanity of this proposal, about sending people back just out of sight, out of mind, so the EU doesn't have to deal with them. The Commission is going to say, look, we tried to have a more humane approach to this, spreading them around Europe, but the national governments just weren't doing it. And what happened? They just built up at that camp in Lesbos, and we saw the tragedy that followed. So this is a more practical approach, recognizing what national governments are actually willing to do. Now, some countries that are more progressive on asylum policy, like Sweden, for example, are going to push back on this. They're going to say this is not a humane policy and that we really need to be addressing the system at root. But it may be the more workable solution considering the fierce resistance to spreading the burden in a physical way from countries like Hungary and Poland. So we should have an early indication, I think by next week, how welcoming those Eastern European countries in particular are to this new proposal.
Thank you very much, Dave Keating, there reporting for us from Brussels.